Johnny Carson once said, "Inviting Frank Sinatra to the show is like inviting a lion to tea at your house. You'll probably have a wonderful time." Probably. And he was right. Because for 17 years straight, every time Frank showed up, the same thing would happen. Johnny's prepared questions went in the trash. The producers lost track of the commercial breaks, and the audience would be doubled over laughing. But one night, that night, Frank didn't just have his usual Jack Daniels in hand. He had 10 coins in his pocket. And because of those coins, nobody just laughed that night. To understand The Tonight Show, you first need to know this: from 1962 to 1992, there was only one man on American television at 11:30 at night, Johnny Carson. Every evening, millions of people would climb into bed, turn on the TV, and watch Johnny do his famous pencil spin. But Johnny wasn't just an ordinary host. The man was a social barometer. If he put you on his show, your career took off. If he made fun of you, everyone was talking about that joke the next day. Presidents, rock stars, Hollywood's brightest names, they all waited in line to sit in that chair. All of them. Except one. Frank Sinatra didn't wait in line. Frank Sinatra made a phone call. Producer Fred de Cordova told this story years later with a laugh. "Frank didn't call, it was announced. We'd planned for Thursday." Frank's assistant called and said, "Make it Friday." So we made it Friday. Johnny's reaction was always the same. He'd shrug, smirk, and say, "At least he's coming." Because when Frank showed up, no script, no producer's meeting, no commercial break schedule could control what happened. When the two of them came together, the stage was theirs. Johnny was sharp. Frank was fearless. Johnny was the master of timing. Frank was a beast of improvisation. Johnny held the audience in the palm of his hand, while Frank acted like he couldn't care less about the audience, but somehow enchanted every single one of them. Ed McMahon, Johnny's loyal sidekick, was the one who summed up their dynamic best. Johnny could interview anyone, but you couldn't interview Frank. You had a conversation with Frank, and only Frank knew where the conversation was going. That night started exactly like that, when Ed McMahon's voice echoed through the studio. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Frank Sinatra." The orchestra hit the first notes of "Fly Me to the Moon." 300 people rose to their feet. Frank walked onto the stage. Same as always. Suit impeccable, tie loose, steps careless but calculated. And in his right hand, a glass of Jack Daniels. Johnny stood up, shook Frank's hand, then looked at the glass, then turned to the camera. The audience was already ready to laugh, because they recognized that look. One eyebrow raised, lips speaking without moving. Frank said, "Johnny, you're the only guest who brings his own drink to this studio. NBC has a bar. It's free." Frank sat down, crossed his legs, took a sip from his glass, and replied without the slightest hurry, "Johnny, I wouldn't give my dog the whiskey your budget can buy." The audience exploded. Ed McMahon let out his trademark exaggerated laugh from the background. That laugh that for years would have people debating, is Ed really laughing or is it just his job? Johnny turned to the audience. "Did you see that? It's been 30 seconds. I'm being insulted on my own show and there's nothing I can do about it, because this man also made me change the day. I said the show's on Thursday. He said move it to Friday. And we moved it." Frank raised his glass. "I had plans on Thursday." "What plans, Frank?" "Private plans." "Private plans," said Johnny, turning to the camera. "So on a Thursday, Frank Sinatra's private plans are more important than America's #1 television show. And I'm not even surprised. That's the summary of our relationship." Frank smirked. That smirk, half dangerous, half affectionate. Completely Sinatra. But this was just the warm-up round. When Johnny brought up Las Vegas, Frank's eyes lit up. Las Vegas was Frank's second home, maybe his first. The Sands Hotel, Caesar's Palace. That stage, those lights, those nights. Johnny asked, "Frank, what were you and the Rat Pack really doing in Vegas?" "Off stage?" Frank thought about it, or pretended to. "Johnny, what happened off stage was more fun than what happened on stage. But I can't tell you because some of them are still alive." The audience laughed. Johnny pressed on. At least tell me something about Dean Martin. Everyone knows the guy anyway. That knowing smile spread across Frank's face. He leaned forward, lowered his voice, as if he were about to reveal a state secret. You know what was in Dean's glass on stage? Whiskey, said Johnny. Apple juice. The audience went silent for a moment. Then a wave of laughter hit. Apple juice, Frank repeated. Dean Martin, America's most famous drunk, was drinking apple juice on stage. He was faking being drunk. The whole thing was an act. Johnny pretended to be shocked. So who was the one actually drinking? Frank raised his glass. Are you asking me? So Dean was the fake drunk and you were the real drunk. Dean was America's most famous fake drunk, said Frank. And I was the most famous real drunk. And the difference is this: Dean woke up rested the next morning, and I woke up having had a great night. Every anecdote that night was better than the last, and the next story was about to bring the house down completely. When Johnny mentioned Don Rickles' name, Frank shook his head before bursting into laughter. Rickles, Hollywood's most merciless comedian, a man who spared no one, Sinatra included, was one of Frank's closest friends, and their most famous story had taken place in a restaurant. Don had gone out on a date with a woman, Frank began. First date, Don wants to impress her. How's he going to do it? He says, I'm a close friend of Frank Sinatra. The audience started laughing because they could sense where this was going. The woman doesn't believe him. Of course, Don panics. He calls me. Frank, come to this restaurant. Stop by my table, say a few words so this woman believes me. So I went. Johnny was leaning forward, and I walked up to the table. Hey Don, how are you, buddy? I said. Frank paused for a moment. The timing was perfect. Don turned to me and said, Can't you see I'm eating, Frank? Don't bother me. The studio erupted. Johnny was slapping the desk. Ed McMahon was doubled over. Even Frank Sinatra, who had seen everything, lived through everything, had tears in his eyes from laughing as he told it. Don Rickles, said Johnny, catching his breath, the only person who tells the guy doing him a favor to get lost. Not the only person, said Frank, but the funniest one doing it. The audience was still laughing, but Frank's next story would weave the first thread of silence between the laughs. Johnny asked about Jilly's. Jilly's, that legendary bar on Manhattan's West Side. The place Frank used like his living room, run by Jilly Rizzo. Frank would sometimes sing there, sit down at the piano. The bar would go silent, everyone holding their breath. One night I was at Jilly's, said Frank. I'm sitting at the piano, playing something quiet. Everyone in the bar is listening. You know that moment? Perfect silence, perfect music, perfect night. And, said Johnny. And you barged in. The audience laughed. Johnny grinned guiltily. You opened the door like you were going to kick it down and yelled, Damn it, Frank. I said 10:30. You were late, said Johnny defensively. I'm Sinatra, Johnny. Sinatra is never late. Everyone else is early. So what happened? Frank turned to the audience. This man is the only person who ever interrupted Sinatra mid-song, and he's still alive. He paused, looked at Johnny. Only because of me. Johnny's eyes narrowed. What do you mean because of you? Frank put on a serious face for a moment, but his eyes were laughing. Should I tell you about one night, Johnny? Tell me. Frank turned to the audience. The room held its breath. One night Johnny had a little too much to drink. Frank, said Johnny, warning him. And he paid a compliment to the girlfriend of someone he shouldn't have. The audience went, ooh. Johnny buried his face in his hands. Joey Gallo. Crazy Joe Gallo. Nobody was laughing anymore. Those who knew the name knew. One of New York's most dangerous mob figures. Gallo gave his men the order, said Frank. His voice was calm but carried weight. I heard about it. I called Gallo. I said, Joey, this kid is my friend. He made a stupid mistake. Let it go for my sake. The audience was silent. Gallo agreed. And he said, go tell Johnny Carson. If he's breathing, it's because he knows Frank Sinatra. For a few seconds, the only sound in the studio was the hum of the air conditioning. Then Johnny spoke. "Frank," said Johnny, perfectly calm, "did you really need to tell this story on national television?" Frank shrugged. "So you'll remember when I need a favor." The audience dissolved into relieved laughter. The tension broke, but everyone was processing what they'd just heard. Johnny Carson, America's sweetheart, had once been saved from real danger thanks to Frank Sinatra. And the way Frank told it showed the rules of their friendship. "I'll save your life, but then I'll make fun of it forever." As the night went on, the conversation had settled into its beautiful rhythm. Frank telling stories, Johnny needling, the audience laughing, Ed McMahon keeping time with his laughs. Everything was flowing perfectly. You were right in the middle of one of the Tonight Show's golden moments. Then Johnny noticed something. While Frank was talking, his right hand kept touching his pocket. A small movement, almost imperceptible. But Johnny Carson had been reading people for 30 years. A guest's nervousness, a fake smile, a wandering gaze. He caught them all, let most slide, and turned some into questions. This time, he asked, "Frank, you've been playing with your pocket all night. What's in there? Are you carrying a gun?" The audience laughed. Frank laughed too. But then, and it didn't even take him a second, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of coins. He placed them on the desk, started lining them up one by one. The metallic clink echoed through the studio. 1, 2, 3. Johnny was watching. The audience was watching. The cameramen were watching. 4, 5, 6. Ed McMahon had been ready to laugh, but something stopped him. The expression on Frank's face. It wasn't the face of a man about to crack a joke. 7, 8, 9, 10. Exactly 10 coins, lined up on the desk, gleaming under the studio lights. Johnny waited. Silence is the greatest weapon of a good host, and Johnny knew that better than anyone. A few seconds passed. Frank looked at the coins, then looked at Johnny. "I always carry them," said Frank. His voice was different. Lower. Slower. He was still Frank Sinatra, but this time it wasn't the stage Frank talking. It was the real Frank. Johnny asked softly, "Why?" Frank touched the coins, pushed one with his finger, straightened it, put it back. He wasn't rushing. The Tonight Show's millions of viewers, the commercial breaks, the time pressure, none of it could rush Frank Sinatra, especially not about this. 1963, said Frank. December. Johnny's face changed. He knew. Everyone knew, but nobody had ever heard it from Frank's own mouth. They kidnapped Frank Jr. The studio was so quiet you could hear the hum of the camera motors. Frank continued. "My son was 19 years old. He was performing in Lake Tahoe. He wanted to be a singer, like his father. They took him from his room at gunpoint." Frank's voice didn't crack. His hands didn't tremble. Even telling this story, the man wouldn't let go of control, because that's who Frank Sinatra was. Even on the world's biggest stage, he wouldn't let his walls down, but something in his eyes had changed. They were glistening, but not from laughter. The FBI came. They demanded ransom, $240,000. I sent the money in a suitcase. Frank paused. But the hours it took to get him back, 2.5 days. Those were the longest 2.5 days of my life. Johnny didn't say a word, didn't ask, didn't redirect, didn't crack a joke. He just listened. And that was perhaps the most right thing he did that night. "I got my son back," said Frank. "But that night I learned something. The kidnappers had him make a call. Frank Jr. called me from a phone booth. And in that moment I thought, what if he hadn't had the coins? What if he couldn't have called? What if that was the last time I'd heard his voice?" Frank looked at the 10 coins. "From that day on, I carried coins in my pocket every day. Every day. 35 years. Wherever I went. Stage, studio, restaurant, airplane. Always 10. Never again did I want to be in a situation where I couldn't make a phone call." The Tonight Show had seen many moments of silence in its 30-year history. But this was different. In this silence, nobody was uncomfortable. Nobody wanted to speak. Everyone was listening to the voice of a father. Johnny finally spoke. But he didn't say what you'd expect. He didn't deliver an emotional speech, didn't say, "I'm so sorry, Frank," didn't pretend to be holding back tears. Johnny Carson did what he was. He said the right thing to his friend. "Frank," said Johnny in a calm voice, "a man who's carried 10 coins in his pocket every day for 35 years might look tough to the world, but what you're doing, that's what a father does." Frank gave a slight nod. That was Sinatra's way of giving approval, not grand gestures, but small movements. "And now I understand," said Johnny, "why you always lived by your own rules, why you never answered to anyone. Because life taught you that everything can be taken away in one night." Frank looked at the coins on the desk, then looked at Johnny. And what he did was very simple, but it touched the heart of everyone in the studio. He picked up the coins one by one and put them back in his pocket. The same pocket, the same place as always. "Every night before I go to sleep, I check," said Frank. "Keys, wallet, 10 coins. If anything's missing, I don't sleep." Johnny smiled. But this time it wasn't that famous host smile. It was a friend's smile. "You know, Frank," said Johnny, "these days they have card-operated phones." The audience held its breath for a moment. "You're making that joke now, Johnny?" But then that familiar smirk appeared on Frank's face. "I don't trust technology, Johnny. Technology breaks. Coins don't." The audience was laughing and applauding at the same time. And there was something in that applause. They weren't just applauding a funny comeback. They were applauding who Frank Sinatra was, who he really was. That night, The Tonight Show ran longer than usual. The producers delayed the commercial break twice. They wouldn't do that for any guest other than Frank Sinatra. In the final minutes, the two were trading jabs again, as if the 10 coins moment had never happened. But it had. And everyone in the studio knew it. When the closing music started playing, Frank took the last sip from his glass and stood up. Johnny stood up too. The two men shook hands, but the handshake turned into a hug. Brief, firm, the kind two men show each other. No show but real. As Frank walked toward the edge of the stage, he turned and called out to Johnny. "Johnny?" "Yes, Frank." "Good show." Johnny laughed. "It was your show anyway." Frank nodded, raised his glass, the empty glass, and walked into the darkness. The orchestra began playing That's Life. The audience was on its feet, applauding. Johnny turned to the camera. For a moment he said nothing. Then he spun his pencil on the desk and gave that famous look, half a smile on his lips, something both playful and melancholic in his eyes. "I've been sitting at this desk for 30 years, said Johnny, "and I still can't walk in and out of a room like Frank Sinatra." May 14, 1998. Frank Sinatra closed his eyes for the last time at the age of 82. During the funeral preparations, his daughters Barbara and Tina fulfilled their father's final wish. The items they placed in Frank's pocket meant something to everyone who knew him. A bottle of Jack Daniels. He never went out for a single night without it. A pack of Camel cigarettes, always in his left pocket. A Zippo lighter, with his initials engraved on it. And 10 coins. The 10 coins he had carried in his pocket every day for 35 years, checked every night before going to sleep, the memento of the darkest 2.5 days of his life. Frank Sinatra was presented to the world as a tough man. His name was linked to the mob. He fought with journalists. He made his own rules. But those 10 coins in his pocket told a different story. A father's story. The story of a father who carried the fear of losing his son in his pocket every single day for 35 years, who never forgot that fear even on the world's biggest stage. Johnny Carson was one of the people who knew Frank best. And what happened that night on The Tonight Show was a moment where two legends sat side by side for the last time, laughing together and truly seeing each other. Sometimes that's what friendship is. Being able to trade jabs at the same table, and in your quietest moment, feeling that they're right there beside you. Sinatra had everything: fame, money, power. The world knew him as a tough man. But now we know the 10 coins in his pocket were Frank Sinatra's real story. What about you? What's in your pocket?